£20 million cheque. And if that's wrong, again, tell us the additional per person costs. Now, ministers say that they can't possibly tell us any of these things because it is somehow commercially confidential. What a load of total nonsense. This isn't a contract with a company with shareholders and intellectual property rights and competitors who won't bid if they think all their cost details will be scrutinised by other companies. This is an agreement with a sovereign state. If the Kigali government chooses to contract out to a private provider on housing, that might have some commercial considerations, but that's a matter for them, not for us. They claim that somehow it will make it harder to agree deals. Well, that's just, again, they're making up these arguments because they're embarrassed by not wanting to reveal the figures. And in other areas, they have told us the facts. Because in March 2023, the Prime Minister announced £476 million over 3 years for the agreement with France. It was set out in detail. £124 million in 2023-24, £168 million in 24-25, £184 million in 25-26. So we know what the future spending is going to be on that agreement with France. So why not tell us the future spending that's been agreed with Rwanda? In France, the work covers coastal patrols, drones, technology, and we support the work we're being done with France. We do believe it needs to be properly scrutinised to make sure we're getting value for money. But we support working with the police, French police along the coast to prevent dangerous boat crossings and to protect our border security. And we want to go further, working with other countries to tackle the criminal gangs. But why publish those details in full and set them out for several years in advance for France and not for Rwanda? And they can't claim that that's because, well, they might be trying to negotiate other agreements with other countries compared to Rwanda and not with France, because they might have to, in future, negotiate future agreements with Belgium, with the Dutch police, and with other governments, given that the Borders Inspectorate has pointed out that many of the smuggler routes pass through there. But that's not preventing them being public about the facts on the France scheme. So it's time the government just gave us the facts that Parliament would normally be entitled to, that the public, and crucially the taxpayer, should be entitled to. How much of taxpayers' money have they promised to Rwanda for a scheme that is failing?
How much?
So yeah, the motion sets out some of the facts that we want: payments made or scheduled, including the 4th and 5th year figures, the per person costs, the memorandum of understanding that sets out the money agreement, and the agreement between the Home Office and the Treasury while the Prime Minister was Chancellor on costs and numbers, so that we can see what doubts the Prime Minister had, so that everybody has a chance to see those, rather than him hiding them away and not letting the taxpayer see the facts. And so we're holding this Opposition Day debate to give the government the chance to give us the proper figures, figures that cross-party select committees, the PAC, the Home Affairs Select Committee and the Liaison Committee have been asking for. Of course, they've also claimed that none of this matters because it's going to be outweighed by savings from asylum hotels. We'll have to break it to them. All of this money for Rwanda is in addition to asylum hotels. It's been reported this week the Prime Minister has told the Home Office to keep open some asylum hotels. We know their plans for bases and barges have been unravelling. 100 people moved quietly out of Wethersfield in the Home Secretary's constituency and moved into hotels. Plans to put people into Catterick in the Prime Minister's constituency now dropped. It's costing more to keep people on the Bibby Stockholm than it is in hotels. It is total chaos and a total mess, and it is why there are 20% more people in asylum hotels than there were a year ago when the Prime Minister promised to end them. Rwanda doesn't change any of that. And in fact, their migration legislation, supposedly to enable Rwanda, is likely to make the backlog and the costs worse.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Does she agree with me that this is even more important because it's all happening, Rwanda plan is all happening, the lack of clarity over the costs at a time when we can see that the Tories have weakened our border security, we can see that they've broken the asylum system, We can see that for 6 years we've had criminal smuggler gangs continuing to take over the channel, and the Home Office asylum decision-making has collapsed. It's incredibly important we get control of our borders and of our systems at the Home Office, and it's vital that that transparency comes here to Parliament.
Well, my honourable friend is completely right, because the Conservatives over the last 5 years have let criminal gangs take hold along our borders, along the channel. That is undermining our border security. We should be strengthening our border security and also fixing the asylum chaos that has built up over the last few years. That includes going after the criminal gangs, includes other stronger border security measures. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Court of Appeal says the Rwanda capacity will only be about 100 people. We know the Rwandan asylum system is used to only deciding about 100 cases a year, and the Immigration Minister has admitted it's only likely to be hundreds of people. The current backlog is currently over 100,000 people. And last year, over 90,000 people applied for asylum in the UK. So we have a policy that will likely cover less than 1% of those arriving in the UK at a cost of hundreds of millions of pounds that the government will not come clean about. And that raises another important question. Before I get to it, I will give way to both honourable members in turn briefly. Give way to the honourable member.
Thank you very much, and I'm very grateful. Could I just ask, in terms of the Labour Party's policy or proposed policy in addressing border security, will this be to allow offshore processing claims in Turkey?
Well, I'll just say in theory, if somebody was in Turkey and applied for the Homes for Rwanda, sorry, for the Homes for Ukraine scheme, then they would be processed while they were in Turkey. But otherwise, it's not clear what it is the government is proposing or that the honourable member is proposing, because nothing has been proposed by the government. What Labour is proposing is to go after the criminal gangs, including a new cross-border unit, stronger security powers for that cross-border unit, a new security agreement with other European countries, and stopping the boats before they get to the French coast by going after the supply chain of the criminal gangs, and tackling the fact that under the Conservatives there has been a 30% drop in convictions for people smugglers, which just shows they are simply not taking action on the smuggler gangs. Instead, they've let them take hold. Oh, I'll give way to the honourable friend first.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for giving way, and she's making an excellent speech. But would she agree with me that the whole Rwanda scheme is compounded by the fact that we actually have to take people from Rwanda as well under this particular scheme? So, what benefit do we get?
Well, my honourable friend raises a really interesting point, because it's true that the Rwanda Treaty that has been agreed sets out that, first of all, the UK will need to take some refugees from Rwanda, but there's no specification about who pays for those refugees. We know that people who are transferred to Rwanda will be paid for by the UK taxpayer, and also that people can be returned, for example, if they commit serious crimes in Rwanda. So therefore, foreign national offenders effectively are being returned. Again, question mark, we assume from the lack of information that the UK taxpayer would also pay those costs as well. But again, if there's something different, it would be very helpful to know, and the Minister has the opportunity, in response to this humble address, to provide us with all of those costs too. And this is also an opportunity to, I will give way to my honourable friend in a second, it also raises another important question that we've not yet had answers to, which is about the Illegal Migration Act. The suspended provisions are that the Prime Minister in fact often boasts about as if they are law, but which in fact have never been enacted, mean that everyone who arrived in the country after July 2023 should be detained and removed to a third country. Now, the Home Office has suggested that this will be enacted once the flights start to Rwanda, but already there are over 33,000 cases, likely over 40,000 people on that list. So are the ministers really saying that all of those 40,000 people are going to be sent to Rwanda this year, even if they manage to get flights off? Because at the rate that they're talking about sending people to Rwanda, it will take over 100 years to clear that backlog. And all of those people, presumably in hotel accommodation in the meantime, paid for by the UK taxpayer. So will you tell us what the actual plan is on the Illegal Migration Act? Are they planning to implement the Act if the Rwanda bill goes through and push up the backlog for, what, a century? Or are they in fact planning an amnesty on the Illegal Migration Act for tens of thousands of people that they haven't admitted to their backbenchers, and they certainly don't admit in the social media graphics that they send out? Let me give way to my friend.
Does she agree with me that instead of spending this vast amount of money on a failed scheme to Rwanda, Britain and the other European governments ought to be thinking about the numbers of people, many from Afghanistan, who are living in a marginal existence, in desperate poverty and freezing to death on the streets of Calais and other cities around Europe? They are the victims of human rights and war all around the world. Shouldn't we be thinking about them and helping them rather than pouring money into the Rwandan government, which has achieved absolutely nothing?
Well, my honourable friend raised an important point about particularly the issues around Afghanistan, where we know that there's been huge persecution by the Taliban. We also know there are people who helped our armed forces and who worked for the UK government effectively in Afghanistan, and as a result of that have been targeted by the Taliban. The Afghan relocation scheme, the Afghan resettlement scheme that the Home Office set up has had all kinds of problems with it, and it is important that there are proper reforms to the resettlement schemes to make sure that they are effective, but also that they prevent people being exploited by people traffickers and by people smugglers. And that's why I think it is so important to take action to stop these dangerous boat crossings that are putting lives at risk and that are undermining our border security, and where the criminal gangs have made profits of probably £500 million now over the last few years as a result of being able to take hold along the channel. I will give way to the member.
She mentioned 34,000 cases so far since the legal migration bill. Of those cases, if they're found to have no credible case for asylum to stay in the United Kingdom, and if they come from countries for whom it's virtually practically impossible to return them, what would she do with those people?
Yes.
Well, as the honourable member know, we should be returning people who don't have a foundation in persecution or conflict, who don't have a well-founded asylum claim. They should be being returned to their own country. But what he will also know is that there has been a 50% drop in the returns of failed asylum seekers since 2010. That's been a huge drop, and actually what we should be doing is working with a new returns and enforcement unit with proper staffing in place to actually reverse that drop. He will also be aware, because I know that this was evidence that was given to the Home Affairs Select Committee, where I know he has worked immensely hard over many years and takes these issues very seriously, that only 5% of those who arrived from Albania, including on small boats over the last few years, only 5% of those cases have actually been returned to Albania. So whilst we support the Albania agreement, in fact, it's predominantly only being used to return historic cases and actually hasn't been used for exactly the kinds of cases he's talking about, when people should be having cases and decisions made really quickly and should be being returned quickly, and where we should have fast-track decisions being made.
Answered a question I didn't ask. Specifically, not Albanians, those people from countries that she knows it is practically impossible to return them. The Iranian government won't let them off the plane. Eritreans would put them in jail and say they would be appealed on human rights. Countries like that, what would her party in the government do with those people in the country, having come here illegally, with no basis on which they can stay and no way of negotiating returns agreements with countries like Iran?
Yeah, quite.
The honourable member will know that from the countries like Eritrea and Iran, very often people are granted asylum, and actually, though they are not going to be sent to Rwanda on his government's policy, because they're only going to be able to take around 100 people a year, around a couple of hundred people a year, at a cost of hundreds of millions of pounds. And that is the core dishonesty and the failure at the heart of the government's programme, that what they're doing is somehow promising people that they're going to make huge changes to the existing system, and actually they're not at all. Instead, if anything, all they are going to do is stack people up in asylum hotels for even longer than the taxpayer is currently funding them, currently a bill for £8 million a day, up from £6 million a day as well. On the asylum backlog, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister declared the asylum backlog cleared. That's what he said, which is honestly taking the country for fools. There are 99,000 cases in the backlog. That is probably around over 120,000 people. And all they've tried to do is clear the cases before July 2022. In other words, cases that are already more than 18 months old. Well, frankly, those cases shouldn't be in the system by now anyway. Any properly functioning system would have cleared cases that were more than 18 months old, but that is the scale of Tory chaos. But while they just tried to catch up with themselves, clearing those very old cases, of course, the backlog since July 2022 has doubled. And even their weak and limited target to clear the so-called legacy backlog has failed. 4,500 cases not cleared, and 35,000 cases that have just been withdrawn. So that's what we want the facts about. What's happened to those 35,000 cases? We know from the evidence to the Select Committee in November that 17,000 of them, up to November, the Home Office has no idea where they are. So, of the 35,000, how many of them does the Home Office know to have left the country? How many of them do they know to have deceased or to be duplicate cases? But how many are people who are probably still here, maybe working illegally, maybe starting their asylum application all over again, going back to the beginning of the system, maybe destitute on the streets, whatever has happened to them, still here and the Home Office not having a clue. So can you give us that breakdown of the 35,000? Because otherwise, and whether there's enforcement action taken, if those cases are people who shouldn't be here, because otherwise all this looks like is more smoke and mirrors from a dodgy salesman PM. We do support some of the government's measures around France, and we support the agreement with Albania. We want to see more proper international cooperation like that, and we should be going on steroids to tackle the criminal gangs. I will just give way one more time because I need to finish to let other people speak.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. She will recall that at the end of the last Labour government, there were returns at the rate of one every 8 minutes. Doesn't that really demonstrate that where there's a will to deal with this, we can tackle those who shouldn't be in the country and welcome those who should?
Well, my honourable friend is right, and that's why we, Labour will set up a new returns unit, 1,000-strong staff to do returns and enforcement, to actually get returns agreements in place, to go through individual cases and to reverse this 50% drop in the returns that has taken place since 2010. Because as part of our 5-point plan to strengthen border security, fix the Tories asylum chaos, instead of the Rwanda scheme, using that money to fund proper action to go after the criminal gangs, new cross-border police, stronger powers similar to counter-terror powers, new security agreements with Europol and other countries, stopping the boats reaching the French coast in the first place, properly clearing the backlog, ending hotel use, a major returns and enforcement unit, alongside reform to resettlement routes, so the UK continues to do our bit to help those fleeing conflict and persecution, but so we prevent people being exploited by criminal gangs, and proper international cooperation and plans to deal with the problems at source, providing support for refugees in the region, something that this government has repeatedly cut back. We believe in strong border security and a properly controlled and managed asylum system, so the UK does its bit to help those fleeing persecution and conflict, as we've always done, but those with no right to be here are swiftly returned. Under the Tories, we have none of those things. We just have chaos. We just have a con. 5 broken promises from a failing Prime Minister to clear the backlog, it's still 100,000. To stop the boats last year, it was the second highest on record. To end hotel use, instead it went up, not down. To return everyone when returns are down 50%. To pass a new law, which, to be fair, he did pass a new law, he just didn't implement it. And that is the problem with this Prime Minister. Shiny graphics, but shoddy gimmicks. Wide-eyed promises, but never delivering. They all know it. They all know it. That's why all of them should be calling for the same facts as us, because it will expose what is really going on in this government, the con on everyone. So stop letting their own front bench play smoke and mirrors. They should be asking for those figures. The House should be getting those figures. Those are the figures we need. That is what the humble address should deliver. I move it to put it to the House.
Question is, as on the order paper, Minister Tom Percival.
Well, thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and the opposition benches may not believe this, but I have to say that I'm very grateful to them for giving us this opportunity this afternoon to debate this important issue, one that undoubtedly matters to people across this country, and let's set the record straight. And I'm grateful because it does provide me with the opportunity to highlight the fact that this government has a plan, a credible plan, to tackle illegal migration. And some things never change. When I moved on to the DWP in October 2022, the party opposite had no credible plan. I returned 14 months later, and guess what? There's still no credible plan. Some things never change. And it's same old Labour, ignoring the British people's priorities, wanting to try and glide to power under the radar without saying anything credible about these issues. In contrast, we have a credible plan and we are working through it. It is delivering results. And one aspect, one plank of that plan should not be seen in isolation. It needs to be seen in a joined-up way. Small boats' arrivals to the UK were down by a third last year. And they may not want to hear that, but that reflects the fact that the plan and the earlier steps that were taken are working. This bucked the trend that was seen across Europe, where illegal migration had risen. And our European partners are following our lead, with Italy, Germany, Austria and others all exploring models similar to ours. The government met its target of eliminating the legacy asylum backlog, and there is improved efficiency across the system, and we will take forward that learning as we set about dealing with the outstanding cases. The use of hotels to accommodate asylum seekers is costing the taxpayer over £8 million each day. And one thing is for sure, is that if we were to take the do-nothing approach, to do absolutely nothing about the flow of cases into the system, which is precisely what her policy would result in, all you would see is ballooning costs. That's unfair, that's unsustainable, and that's why we've taken concrete steps to return hotels to their rightful uses, with 50 due to be handed back to the community this month. And I'll gladly give way to the Honourable Lady.
The Minister for giving way on that point in terms of hotels, and I hope that the Minister has had an opportunity to visit some of these hotels. It's not just about the costs, which are increasing, it's about the situation and dire conditions that people waiting for their claims to be assessed have to go through. Families living in rooms, no access to food, no access for space for their children to learn. It is not a nice environment for people who just want their claims assessed. Will the Minister get to grips with that, please?
Yes, I think it is absolutely right that the government prioritises closing hotels. That is a policy that we have set, that we are delivering against. They keep saying that it's going up. What we are seeing is hotels being closed. That is happening week on week, and we will continue to sustain that process. I'll gladly give way to the Shadow Home Secretary. Perhaps you'll have a credible policy to put to the House.
Would he confirm that the latest figures are that the number of people in asylum hotels is 20% higher than last December, when the Prime Minister promised to end asylum hotel use, and that the costs have gone up from 6 million a day, when the Prime Minister complained about it last December, to over 8 million a day, as he just said today?
Yes or no?
Yes.
The fact is that we are closing asylum hotels, and it is absolutely the right strategy to take. And what I might say is that I regularly hear from colleagues across this House complaining about hotels being open in their constituencies I want to get on and close those hotels. My colleagues want to get on and close those hotels, and that is precisely what we will do. And to just continue with the status quo in the way that the Honourable Lady, the Right Honourable Lady, advocates in terms of the flow of people into the system is not sustainable. And don't forget that all of those individuals who are making these perilous crossings of the Channel, facilitated by evil criminal gangs, are all coming from what is a fundamentally safe country, and that is why, through the multifaceted approach to this issue, we will get to grips with it, because we are attacking illegal migration at every stage through work at both home and abroad. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll gladly give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you very much. The Minister may be aware that the Great Northern Hotel, which was once the flagship hotel for Peterborough, was asylum accommodation, but a Peterborough-based campaign means that that hotel has been stood down and now plans to be part, or could be part, of the £70 million regeneration package in the Station Quarter. But is he surprised to learn that Labour councillors in Peterborough oppose that and want the Great Northern Hotel to remain a migrant hostile asylum accommodation?
Disgraceful.
I mean, I have to say to my honourable friend that there are very few things that surprise me about the Labour Party, and often the things that they say and do not always match the rhetoric of the front bench. And their policies around this, or lack of, speak for themselves in this regard. The fact is that my honourable friend was an ardent advocate for getting that hotel closed. I'm grateful for the representations that he has made, and as a government we will continue with the mission that we are on, which is to get this issue under control, to close these hotels and to make sure that our borders and migration system is sustainable for the future. And Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll gladly give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you very much, and I thank the Minister for giving way. This is called a plan, but actually it's a strategy. The strategy is this: to dissuade, to deter people from getting in boats and crossing the Channel at huge risk.
Yeah.
So Rwanda, it may cost, but actually the implications are far bigger than just sending people to Rwanda.
I think the key point that my right honourable friend has made is that he recognises that this is one part of the overarching strategy that we are taking forward to address this issue. Let's not forget that if we had taken the advice of the benches opposite, who, by the way, have voted against so many of the measures that we put in place to try and address this, what we would not have seen is crossings down by a third. What we would not have seen is the Albanian arrivals dropping by 90%. What we would not have seen is hotels being closed. It's fortunate that we didn't take their advice, but I dread to think what the situation would be had we done so. I'll gladly give way to him.
Honourable gentleman, but he says he has a plan, but of course over the last 2 years this is the third plan. We had the Illegal Immigration Act, not worked. We had the Nationalities and Borders Act, we were told it was going to stop the boats. And now we've got the Rwanda bill, which we're told has been watered down because Rwanda themselves wanted to comply with international law and conventions that the Tories wanted to breach. So how is that consistent with their claim of taking back control of our borders when Rwanda are dictating to us what our immigration policy is?
It is rather ironic, is it not, hearing from members opposite, and I well remember actually the Shadow Home Secretary being one of the leading lights of the effort to try and keep us in the European Union. I know where her instincts lie on these issues. She was very happy to continue with the free movement of people. She was very willing to have that open door border approach. And he's cited rhetoric from the referendum campaign, but he too has voted against every single measure that we have tried to take forward to make progress on this. But the good news for him is that there is an opportunity to put all of that right and to be in the lobbies next week when we consider the bill, to make sure that we can get on and operationalise this very plan. They keep saying it's a waste of money. They could actually get in the lobbies behind it and help to operationalise it. I'll give way to him.
Grateful for the Minister for giving way. He says hotels are closing, but what I'm finding in my constituency, people are moving into HMOs from hotels. So that isn't dealing with the issue, is it? It's just moving it around.
Well, again, I would make the point to him that the policy platform that he is standing on would do absolutely nothing to reduce the flow of people coming illegally to this country, and all of whom are leaving what are safe countries in order to make those perilous journeys of the Channel with all of the risks to human life that presents. I'll gladly give way to my honourable friend.
Very grateful to the Minister. I mean, let's look at this over a 20-year time span. People were trying to come here illegally in the last Blair government under lorries. We did a load of work. We put X-ray scanners in. We stopped that criminal trade. They're now trying to come by boats. We're putting the work in. We're trying to stop that. Does he agree with me that Labour didn't solve the original problem and they've got no plan to solve the current one?
I think it's fair to say that I agree with her on both fronts. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's important to recognise that this is one of the biggest issues of our time, and the British people want it dealt with once and for all, and so does this government. Our position is clear. That's why we've put in place one of the most comprehensive plans for tackling illegal migration anywhere in the world. And it's why this endeavour is and will remain an absolute priority for myself, for my right honourable friend, for the Home Secretary and for the Prime Minister and the Home Office more generally. I'll gladly give way to him, but I need to make some progress.
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman. Isn't it the case that he keeps citing the British people? Aren't most people in this country looking at what's happened on this very vital question since 2010? 2010, all these years that the government, this government has been in power, and this has only got worse and no policy has really worked. Isn't he ashamed of that fact?
I think it's worth him just reflecting on the fact that the small boats phenomena was not an issue in 2010. And again, yet another Labour member of this House who has voted repeatedly against the various efforts that we have sought to make that have started to really deliver on the progress that I believe the British people want to see. And that the instincts of my constituents and no doubt his constituents lend themselves to getting on and getting to grips with. And that is a fact. The record speaks to that fact, and we will continue to not take the advice of those who would do very little, if anything, to address this issue, and we will get on with delivering on this plan. And it recognises that illegal migration is a highly complex challenge requiring innovative solutions. In the Rwanda partnership, we have just such a solution. We're sending the crystal clear message to those thinking about crossing the Channel to get to the UK that they'll not be able to stay. And let's not forget, as I've said repeatedly, that all those are leaving what are fundamentally safe countries to make those crossings which have been organised by criminal fraternities. Of course, it's true to say that the creation and implementation of a novel approach such as this comes with an expected cost. To date, 240 million has been paid to Rwanda, and those figures have been provided to Parliament. The funding arrangement is seeing the economy of Rwanda boosted, which will benefit both host communities and those relocated there, going to areas such as agriculture, jobs and infrastructure. We've also provided an upfront credit to pay for start-up costs in advance of flights. And while we don't agree with all of the Supreme Court's conclusions, we respect the court. Last month, the Home Secretary signed a new internationally legally binding treaty to address the Supreme Court's conclusions. Crucially, the treaty removes the risk of refoulement and provides an excellent standard of care for all those relocated. Both countries' adherence to their obligations will be robustly monitored. The High Court and the Court of Appeal already confirmed the principle of the partnership to remove those with no right to be here to a safe third country, and that is lawful and compliant with the Refugee Convention. I'll gladly give way to the chairman of the committee.
I thank the Minister for finally giving way to me. He's skipped over the costs, though, of the Rwanda scheme. Yes, we know about the 240 million and the 50 million next year, only, as my right honourable friend said, because it emerged from the Rwanda government. Well, that's being investigated. But can he not just share with the House what the total cost of this scheme is? There is no reason not to. It is a flagship scheme of the government. He's proud of it, very clearly from what he said, so why can't he share us the total cost committed in the treaty?
It's slightly uncharacteristic of the honourable lady to be slightly mean-spirited there. I think it's fair to say that we are having a good debate. the front bench on both sides have taken many interventions, and we have, as government, provided those costings to Parliament, and we will continue to report in the annual report and accounts in the way that is perfectly normal, is perfectly reasonable, perfectly respectable about costs moving forward. The courts acknowledge that Rwanda entered the partnership. I'll give way to the Shadow Home Secretary one last time because I have been generous and I'm conscious there's a lot of members who'd like to speak.
The Minister has been generous. Given that he has published the future costs of the agreement with France, why is he still refusing to publish years 4 and 5 of the Rwanda agreement? We know how much will be paid in 24, 25, 26 for France. Why not tell us the same figures for Rwanda, the taxpayers entitled to know?
That information will be provided in the usual way through the annual report and accounts. And of course, she will recognise that within that there are elements such as the number and circumstances of the number of individuals who will be relocated as part of it. And we will publish those costs, and the transparency will come with that as part of the annual report and accounts, as you would expect. And we've obviously touched on, as part of the debate, the issues around commercial sensitivity and the fact that these are ongoing relationships with our partners. And the courts acknowledge that Rwanda entered the partnership in good faith. The mechanisms we've introduced through the treaty will provide cast-iron guarantees to ensure the welfare of all those relocated. And the Safety of Rwanda Bill, which is the toughest immigration legislation ever introduced to Parliament, will enable Parliament to confirm Rwanda as being safe. There'll be very limited specific circumstances under which someone can claim Rwanda is unsafe for them and their exceptional circumstances. If a foreign court chooses to interfere, we will do whatever it takes to get flights off the ground, and we'll debate all of that again next week. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Rwanda is a beacon of Africa, a country full of potential and promise which stands ready to welcome people into its communities. Rwanda cares deeply about providing humanitarian protection. I'd say it's incorrect and frankly offensive to reduce Rwanda's interest in this policy down to a financial incentive. And claims like that are often made by people who've never been and who choose particularly to ignore the brilliant work that Rwanda does with the UNHCR to provide sanctuary to many people in a spirit of partnership, and is something that I think should be celebrated and welcomed and not reduced. To be clear, the government of Rwanda did not ask for money to sign the treaty, nor did we offer any. That said, Mr. Deputy Speaker, doing nothing is not a free option. It's right that there's additional funding to reflect the costs in the future. The total cost of the partnership will depend on the number of people relocated, timing of when it occurs, and outcomes of individual cases. Rwanda has the capacity to deliver on this uncapped partnership, and we've been working with them to build their capacity over the last year. As I say, it already hosts 135,000 refugees and asylum seekers, working with the UNHCR and other partners. We must stop the boats and save lives. The moral imperative could not be clearer. Ensuring that those who arrive in the UK through unnecessary, illegal and dangerous means, not being able to stay here, should prove a deterrent to others who may try to do the same thing. We need to stop criminal gangs from profiting from this through decisive action. We know that deterrents work. We've seen that clearly demonstrated through the returns agreement with Albania. This strong deterrent has seen us return 5,000 Albanians in 2023 alone, and Albania arrivals fall by 90%. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we want every people smuggler to know that the UK is off limits, and we will not tolerate any further loss of life. Neither will we accept the strain that high levels of illegal migration place on our communities and our public services. To the criminal gangs profiting off of misery, we say to you, your despicable business model will no longer be viable. We remain firmly committed to getting flights off the ground to Rwanda as soon as possible. We want the British people to know that we're putting them and their interests first. We will not be deterred. We accept and embrace the challenge. Unlike them, we have a credible plan, we're working through it, and we're making progress. And by sticking the course, we can and we will stop the boats.
Yeah. Order. 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 There are some 14 members who are seeking to take part in the debate. We have to go into the wind-ups at about 20 to 7. By my miserable maths, that means I need to put an immediate time limit of 5 minutes on speeches after the SNP spokesman. I may have to bring that down. We'll see how we go. Alison Phillips.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I would like to put on record yet again the SNP wholeheartedly oppose the principle of the Rwanda plan, of offshoring people as if they were some kind of tiresome trash that the UK doesn't want to deal with, a plan that amounts simply to state-sponsored people trafficking. It isn't just about the money, as Labour have set out in their motion today, as egregious and obscene a waste of money this is. It's about how we treat our fellow human beings. People who have experienced torture, seen their families murdered, are running from horrors that we are fortunate never to have known. They deserve much better than being yeeted to Rwanda, a country that the Supreme Court has found is both unsafe and without the administrative capacity to take on this sensitive role the UK government is putting upon them. According to the latest UNHCR data, the majority of those who do flee, some 69%, stay in neighbouring countries. Low and middle income countries currently host 75% of the world's refugees and other people in need of international protection. For those that do make it to our shores, they are more often than not already with ties to the UK, ties of a family, of language, or the long legacy of war and empire. UK ministers often make the wild assertion that the 110 million displaced people around the world are somehow all making their way to Dover, and that the Rwanda plan is some kind of deterrent. This is not an assertion based in reality. I would like to make some progress on the speech because, as the Speaker said, we're quite short of time. To take Afghanistan as an example, 6 million Afghans have been classed by UNHCR as refugees. 91% of those Afghans have stayed in neighbouring countries. 3.5 million almost in Iran, just over 2 million in Pakistan. There are 239,600 in Germany, 71,200 in France, and just 12,200 in the UK, a mere 0.2% of the total. Yet Afghans have...
If Scotland was an independent country, given there are 100 million people displaced, how many people would Scotland take in?
I've just made the point that of those 110 million people, a very tiny proportion actually come. And I would also like to point out to him that putting a very specific number cap on things hasn't worked either. I remember the government across the way saying they were going to get net migration down to the tens of thousands, and that hasn't worked either. So our numbers are not worth speaking about in this debate in the way that he thinks that they are. It's a spurious argument, and he should learn to look much harder at this issue rather than putting a very basic interpretation onto this argument. What he ought to know is that Afghans have consistently made up a very high proportion of people coming across the Channel in small boats. And I have pointed out repeatedly in this place to various ministers at various times that this is a sign of the failure of the supposed safe and legal routes that they have set up. For every one Afghan who's arrived in a resettlement scheme, around 90 have arrived by small boat. Just imagine that if the UK government schemes were not so riddled with incompetence, no Afghan need risk setting foot on a dinghy. No person need sell everything that they own, be exploited, beg, borrow and steal and be bonded in debt to people smugglers at all if they had schemes that actually worked. And it bears repeating that the only way to claim asylum is to get yourself to the UK. You can't claim an embassy overseas. Airlines and ferries won't board you if you don't have the requisite visa to get here. Small boats are very much the last resort, not an easy option. Their use has increased as the routes via lorries and other means have become more difficult. Ministers talk about the expense of the asylum system, but this has come about largely as a result of their own incompetent administration. Downgrading roles in asylum casework, creating a work culture so toxic that employees don't stay, a lack of expertise and unmanageable caseloads. The issues with the backlog are entirely of their own making, and they deserve no brownie points at all for attempting to fix what they broke. We know that the Home Office's new asylum backlog stands just shy of 100,000 people whose cases still require to be processed. And I see these folk at my surgeries each and every week, and they certainly don't perceive much of an improvement from the Home Office, despite the Minister's spin. Ministers appear to have massaged the figures to make their legacy backlog reduce from 92,000 to just under 5,000, but a cynic might wonder why around a third of these backlog cases are not actually decisions made, but withdrawals. Free Movement have said the heavy use of withdrawals to reduce the number of pending applications does make it look as though the backlog clearance was an exercise in number management more than anything else. And ministers can't tell us where these 31,000 people are within the system. These 30,000 people are within the system either. It's also worth noting that the first year of the Immigration Tribunal has also seen a 20% increase in outstanding appeals, which now stands at 31,000. I would question also the further cost to parts of the immigration system due to this political focus on dealing with the backlog. For example, I have heard increasing instances of international student visas not being processed in time for the start of term, and people having to defer their studies because they've missed so much of the course that they can't turn up and go and study as they had planned to. For those that recall in the previous debate my mention of a Sudanese constituent whose wife has been shot in the leg while waiting a year and a half for a family reunion application. I wrote to the Home Secretary on this and finally received a letter from a civil servant saying, and I quote, "There are considerable delays in family reunion decision-making at this time, and applications are being considered out of the 60 working day service standard." I mean, 60 working days would have been quite good for this woman, because had it been processed in time at the time, she would have been out of Sudan before the current conflict broke out. Now she waits in a very unsafe situation for a minister to make progress on this matter. How long must she and others wait? The former Immigration Minister even admitted on TV in last August that processing asylum claims quickly just encourages more people to come. And of course, he's never presented evidence to back up that assertion. If delays of several years are a feature, not a bug, then Home Office ministers are on shaky ground when they girn about the cost of keeping asylum seekers in hotels. They have set the system up to work in this way. And quite aside from the eye-watering £8 million a day, over £3 billion a year, it costs to accommodate asylum seekers in inadequate hotel accommodation, there is a human cost in keeping people in limbo. The asylum seekers that I listen to want to be able to work, to contribute, to rebuild their lives. They are skilled, they are talented people with a lot to give to their communities. They are grateful for the opportunity. But the longer they are kept out of the labour market, prevented from working, they lose their skills, their confidence, and their mental health deteriorates. And I have seen far, far too many people at my advice surgeries who cannot understand a system that treats them with such disdain. A recent Scottish Government analysis paper draws an analysis from NISA which suggests that granting the right to work to people seeking asylum in Scotland would add £30 million per year on average to the Scottish economy if granted immediately on arrival, or £16 million per year if granted after a 6-month waiting period. Tax revenues increase, support costs reduce. Only a government so wedded to a toxic ideology would refuse to accept such a logical position. Stranger still, Mr Deputy Speaker, that this persists because we know in this place that all policies come through the Treasury. The Prime Minister himself apparently voiced concerns regarding the cost of the Rwanda policy during his time as Chancellor, as it was reported that he wished to pursue smaller volumes initially, 500 instead of 1,500 in the first year of the scheme, 3,000 instead of 5,000 in years 2 and 3. The paper seen by the BBC also suggested that he was reluctant to fund so-called Greek-style reception centres, sites where migrants could be housed rather than being put up in hotels. The documents say the Chancellor is refusing to fund any non-detained accommodation, e.g. Greek-style reception centres, because hotels are cheaper. We can see this quite clearly from the example of the Bibby Stockholm, which over £22 million is more expensive per night than putting people in hotels. Neither the Minister for Legal Migration and Delivery nor the Director-General for Migration and Borders at the Home Office could vouch for the value for money of this vessel or provide comparative figures when they came to the Home Affairs Select Committee in December. And the private companies who provide this accommodation, Mears, Serco, Clearspring, CTM and the rest, are raking it in. Misery is lucrative. Home Office ministers often talk up the nebulous concept of deterrence, but oddly enough can provide very little evidence to back it up. And we know from the papers seen by the BBC that the now Prime Minister, he didn't believe that the deterrent would work. Now he's Prime Minister, suddenly he will chuck any amount of money into the same vague concept. The Minister said it was the toughest bill ever, well, since the last one, and the one before that, neither of which have worked, and some of which haven't even been implemented. Free Movement have published a useful graph indicating that the Nationality and Borders Act and the Illegal Migration Act have not had any deterrent effect on figures. There is no evidence to suggest that this new Rwanda legislation will be any different. No wonder the current Home Secretary reportedly called it batshit. And it won't even work. And we know this because the Home Office have earmarked at least £700 million to manage small boats until 2030. If it was going to stop the boats, they wouldn't be earmarking this money in their budget for boats that they expect to keep coming. It's ludicrous. As well as being illegal and immoral, the Rwanda scheme is eye-wateringly expensive. The UK government's own figures estimated that removing each individual to Rwanda would cost £63,000 more than keeping them in the UK. And if the government were to send every asylum seeker who arrived last year, this would have cost £7.7 billion. £7.7 billion. The member opposite truly believe that this is a price worth paying, particularly when people are struggling to feed themselves in this country in a cost of living crisis. And given the absurd costs, the Home Office have been understandably reticent about providing more details of the scheme. Permanent Secretary Sir Matthew Rycroft initially provided details of the £140 million paid, £120 million through the Economic Transformation Integration Fund and a separate £20 million to cover set-up costs. But told the Home Affairs Select Committee that it couldn't provide details of further payments as it was commercially sensitive information and would only be released in the annual report and accounts each year. He was then forced into providing further costs in a letter to the Public Accounts Committee outlining a further £100 million was paid to Rwanda in April last year, and with another £50 million due in this year. During the debate in the Rwanda bill, the Home Secretary confirmed the deal with Rwanda had also included further payments of £50 million in 2025 and £50 million in 2026, bringing the total cost to the scheme to approaching £400 million without a single asylum seeker having been sent there. It's a cost of about £130 million per Home Secretary that's been to Rwanda. And an FOI revealed that the government has spent £2.1 million as of last month defending the scheme in the courts. With new legal challenges to the bill and to the treaty, more costs to the taxpayer are surely yet to come. And all the time, while this cruel posturing continues, the number of people waiting for asylum decisions grows, safe and legal routes have not emerged and have been closed down, Home Office staff are left without the resources that they need, and it really is, all in all, an expensive distraction from the dull and boring work of governing well. As it is Labour's debate, I want to focus just briefly on their plans. And as the Honourable Member for Arfon highlighted earlier on in his question, the Shadow Home Secretary didn't rule out offshoring people in their, should they begin government. So I want to ask the Labour Party, is it the cost or the principle of offshoring that they object to? I was particularly interested in the papers released by the National Archives over Christmas and the paper presented by Jonathan Powell to the Blair government entitled Asylum, the Nuclear Option, which suggested interning people in Mull or the Falkland Islands and deporting people to Turkey and Kenya. When officials from the Home Office warned that the measures would fall foul of the UK's international obligations to refugees, the Prime Minister's handwritten note read, "Just return them, this is precisely the point. We must not allow the ECHR to stop us dealing with it." 20 years on, how chillingly reminiscent of the current Conservative government. And back in 2003-04, Labour were also trying to find a way of offshoring people to Tanzania, and it had been reported that they have been recently consulting with the architects of that Tanzania plan. So if Labour still plans to offshore people, how many? On what terms? At what cost? How can it possibly be cost effective to send people halfway around the world only to bring them back if their case is successful? And when Full Fact asked Lord Blunkett about these historic plans, he said he'd looked at a system for processing appeals for failed asylum seekers in other safe countries, but had rejected it as impractical. So are Labour for or against offshoring, on principle or on cost? Will they categorically rule this out? Or are they prepared to sell out the world's most vulnerable just to get them over the threshold to number 10? It doesn't need to be this way. Everything that has happened has been a political choice. This is about our duties and obligations in the world, about the ECHR, which protects all of our rights, and about the Refugee Convention, which treats others as we would expect to be treated if a catastrophe happened on our own doorstep. Scotland wants none of these cruel, inhumane plans. The Scottish Government have published papers setting out our direction of travel on this, and I commend them to all who are listening. The Scotland that we seek would take her duties to the world seriously. The spirit of Kenmure Street tells us that these are our neighbours, our friends, and we must do our part to see that they are safe.
Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, it is unfortunate that backbenchers will have under a third of this already truncated debate on what's a very important subject. But can I start by praising the opposition for starting the new year as consistently as they ended the last one, consistently undermining and attacking the government's policies to tackle illegal migration and questioning the cost and cost-effectiveness of such measures, whilst consistently voting against those measures to tackle illegal migration no fewer than 86 times, consistently failing to come up with any serious practical alternative measures to clamp down on illegal migration themselves, and when they do produce flimsy and thought-through measures, as they did before Christmas, they're completely opaque about the cost or any aspect of any effectiveness at all. Today, Mr. Deputy Speaker, they have excelled themselves, and again using an Opposition Day debate, light on substance, light on comprehensiveness, completely light on viable alternatives, and light on throwing any light on anything they would do at all. Time and time again, they've been challenged to come up with their own plans and have failed. Now, as you know, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I've been pretty consistent myself, both on and off the Home Affairs Select Committee, in challenging ministers and officials on the workings and often shortcomings of migration policies for more clarity and more evidence, including on the withdrawals figures, where we challenged the Permanent Secretary just before Christmas, which is the only part of this motion I actually agree with. There's clearly they got the idea from the Home Affairs Select Committee and then just cut and pasted it here today. Having visited with the Home Affairs Select Committee Tirana, Paris, Brussels, Calais, Belgian beaches, asylum seeker accommodation, detention centres, border force operations and so on, I know that illegal migration is a complex and challenging issue, which the PM quite rightly has identified as a priority for the British people. But the Rwanda scheme is not just one element of that bigger solution. No one is claiming it's ideal, and as the Supreme Court has judged, it has flaws in its design to overcome, which the government is now addressing. But essentially, it is there to deal with one major problem, an unfairness which undermines the generosity of the British public in rightly providing and funding a safe haven for asylum seekers genuinely fleeing conflict, persecution and danger. And until you can answer that question, then you really lack credibility in tackling the government's attempts to do so. And that question is, as I raised earlier with the Shadow Home Secretary, to which she didn't have an answer, what do you do with migrants from certain countries who have entered the UK illegally, who do not have credible claims remaining in the UK, yet it's virtually impossible to return those people to their country of origin? I'll give way.
And on that point, he will know, and I know from my own experience with foreign national offenders, how difficult it is for countries of origin to accept them back. Very often they just won't acknowledge their existence, because of course it's not going to be in their interest to take back people who they might think are a detriment to them. And he mentions Eritrea, Vietnam, there's a lot of other countries. This is difficult stuff, and he's right to press the loyal opposition to come up with something more than the sound bites that we've heard.
Well, I completely agree with my right honourable friend, because effectively, once those people make it into British territorial waters, they're effectively guaranteed to be living in the UK at the UK taxpayers' expense for the foreseeable future. And that's why the Rwanda scheme aims to address. It's a deterrent to stop people making that dangerous journey in the first place. And it will become a lottery whether they end up in a hotel in Kent or on a plane to Rwanda. And I've said time and time again, when the Home Affairs Select Committee went to Calais in January, we were told by all the officials dealing with the schemes over there that when the government announced the Rwanda scheme initially, there was a surge in people at Calais seeking to regularise their migration status in France because they did not want to risk being put on that plane to Uganda. So we know it has a deterrent effect. I will one last time.
Member of the Home Affairs Select Committee, would he agree that those same officials said it was crucial that the United Kingdom government have a strong deterrent policy as part of the other policies to protect our borders?
Right, and other countries have shown an interest in it, as did the officials when we spoke to them in France. And other countries want a part of the action that Rwanda may be getting. Once this scheme actually starts, it can unlock a whole host of opportunities. And I hope that ultimately we can have a series of European countries, particularly in North Europe, working together on a multifaceted networked Rwanda-type scheme. So people smugglers thrive on any attempts to suggest that schemes like this will actually not take off. So the opposition is doing a disservice and actually only playing into the hands of the people smugglers by trying to undermine the Rwanda scheme without coming up with any alternative that would seriously damage the trade of the people smugglers in the first place. So it's right that we should give the Rwanda scheme space to get off the ground, literally, and it's also right we should scrutinise the effectiveness of the scheme. But it needs to be put in the context of the alternatives. What's the cost of accommodating asylum seekers who've entered the UK illegally in hotels or other rented accommodation awaiting their decisions? On the basis of £6 million a day or £8 million a day for hotels alone, every additional £100 million on the Rwanda scheme, estimated to be spent, would accommodate hotels for just 17 days. Let's put it in that context. There's also, what's the cost of multi-agency control and operations centres, Border Force and others patrolling the English Channel and picking up the boats? Where is the reference in this motion to more transparency on how the 480 million subsidy we're now giving to the French police force is being spent, despite the fact that the record subsidy, the interception rates by the French authorities actually fell last year, and there's evidence that some of our money is being used in operations on the Franco-Italian border rather than on the Channel as well. Those are the comparisons that need to be made. Now, Labour came up earlier last year, the Right Honourable Lady there, with the 5-point plan last March. It turned out that most of those 5 points were already being undertaken by the government anyway. So before Christmas, there was this story that Labour is considering detailed plans for a so-called offshoring scheme. And that apparently under the last Labour government, they were discussing with David Blunkett and others an offshoring to Tanzania scheme, something that's been described by the current Labour leader as a gimmick. So why the change of heart? What is different in the principles of what they're now looking at, apparently, from the Rwanda plan offshoring migrants? Is this a change of heart in the policy? And if so, why are they still objecting to the Rwanda scheme? Or is it they just don't like Rwanda? Or is it they just don't like the cost of it? In which case, what's the cost of their own scheme? So if they're going to criticise what the government is doing because lack of transparency, their potential schemes, which have been denied and then not denied, are completely and utterly opaque. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is a sham, it is a shambles, it is a Labour gimmick, a con, a feeble attempt to show that they are somehow tackling illegal migration by talking about it, by attacking the government, voting against every measure to bring forward practical measures, whilst having no credible working plans of their own. They need to be called out for it, and I should be voting against this motion.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to focus my remarks on the cost of the Rwanda plan, whether it's going to be effective and whether it's value for money. Nearly 18 months ago, the Home Affairs Select Committee stated in our report on channel crossings, and I quote, "The Home Office must provide detailed costings for its migration and economic development partnership with Rwanda, including estimates of the likely cost within the current financial year of relocations and probable costs of relocations during the full 5 years of the programme." We made those recommendations all those months ago, in part because we learned that the then Home Secretary had been required to issue a ministerial direction to the Home Office's Permanent Secretary to implement the Rwanda scheme, as he felt there was insufficient evidence of deterrent to enable him to guarantee the policy's value for money, which is, as the accounting officer, something he is responsible for, and to date he has not changed his view. The issue and the use of public money for this controversial plan has been a source of contention amongst many from the get-go, which is why we believe transparency about the costs involved was vital for proper scrutiny and public trust in this policy. And yet, here we are, with what limited information we do have about the scheme's costs, having dribbled out slowly and most recently accidentally via the International Monetary Fund's board papers. This is despite questions about the costs being repeatedly put by myself and other committees, including the Public Accounts Committees, over the last 18 months. And the most recent substantive update on costs came in a late-night letter from the Permanent Secretary to myself and the Chair of the Public Accounts Committee following that inadvertent disclosure via IMF papers. And we learned that following the £140 million paid to Rwanda in 22-23, there had been an additional £100 million in April 23, and a further £50 million would be paid in 24-25. But the deal with Rwanda is for 5 years, and we are yet to discover what the government has pledged to pay for the final 2 years of the scheme. Now, the justification, and I've heard it again today, is about commercial sensitivity. And yet, apparently, it is not so commercially sensitive that the cost can't be disclosed retrospectively via the annual accounts. Clearly, there's something there that doesn't add up, and I know the chair of the Public Accounts Committee shares my view on this, that in other instances, it's been possible to have regular updates on the spending on proposals and policies like this. Now, question marks don't just hang around over the fixed costs of the scheme, they also hang over the per-person costs of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. We know the government has pledged to pay Rwanda a certain amount for each asylum seeker sent there to have their claim processed, but here again, we don't know how much, although it's of interest that the Home Office estimate in the economic impact assessment of the Illegal Migration Act put the cost of relocating a single individual seeking asylum to a third country at £169,000, which represents, we are told, an additional cost incurred relative to processing an individual through the current migration system. We understand the cost of processing asylum claims here in the UK through the current migration system is around £12,000. So as the Home Affairs Committee pointed out almost 18 months ago, migration, including irregular migration across the English Channel, is an issue on which no magical solution is possible, and on which detailed, evidence-based, properly costed and fully tested policy initiatives are far more likely to achieve sustainable incremental change. I'm going to carry on. Now, with the singular yet untested Rwanda scheme swallowing up so much government time and resource, it is vital that the Home Secretary is upfront about the costs involved. This is about public money being paid by the UK to Rwanda on an issue of great concern to the British people. It's not private funds being exchanged between two companies. And as the Institute for Government point out, good scrutiny really can contribute to good government. Transparency is key to unlocking good public policy. It's therefore absolutely right that Parliament asks and gets detailed responses to questions concerning the cost of the government's Rwanda plan and administration of the asylum system. This is about Parliament being able to do its fundamental job of scrutiny, holding the executive to account. I haven't got time to ask all the other questions I'd like to raise, which relate to the treaty that's been signed, the new appeal system, the right to legal advice for all asylum seekers sent to Rwanda. Will there be additional monies being paid by the British government for all of those? But I hope the Minister will come clean in his winding up as to the exact figures that this scheme is costing.
Order. In order to accommodate all members as best I can, after Sir Robert Buckland, the time limit is going to have to drop to 4 minutes. Sir Robert Buckland.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady, the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, and I must say that I think in her speech she actually addresses the motion that's tabled in the name of her front bench and actually comes to the meat of the issues in a very succinct way. And I think the arguments that she has put before the House are ones that are legitimate, they are ones that merit close scrutiny by both her committee and indeed the Public Accounts Committee, and were indeed the subject of a letter that I know that she jointly sent with the chair of that committee on the 8th of December. And I'm putting my Select Committee chair hat on. I associate myself with those remarks in a spirit of cross-party cooperation. However, it does seem to me, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the front bench have stumbled in to what is, frankly, a debate between the select committees and the government. And frankly, they've missed a trick on this motion, because whilst we are now becoming used to humble addresses, they became very much a fad and a fashion, much beloved of the now leader of the opposition when he was Shadow Brexit Secretary back in 2017, 2018. Those of us in that Parliament perhaps don't want to be reminded of those times. I certainly remember being on that front bench as Solicitor General during the great debate on the contempt of Parliament that we well remember. I bear the scars on my back. I could simply fold my arms and say that humble addresses are very 2019 and perhaps we've moved on. But I don't do that because a number of humble addresses in the past, or resolutions related to humble addresses, have not related to disclosure to the full House, but disclosure direct to select committees. And here is the point that perhaps we could have reached some compromise on, because select committees are more than capable, through the good offices of their chairs and their clerks, to hold sensitive information in a confidential way and yet still provide that scrutiny and accountability that clearly Parliament is here to do. It's been done in the past, and it may well be on this occasion that my honourable and right honourable friends on the front bench should actively consider whether or not, if there is commercially sensitive information, it can be shared in a sensible way with the appropriate select committees. And I think the honourable lady, yes, and of course I'll give way.
To the right honourable gentleman, and he makes an interesting point, because both the Home Affairs Select Committee and the Public Accounts Committee have asked for information that we would hold confidentially, just so we can reassure ourselves about the value for money of these schemes. And we've been refused by the Home Office to have that information, sadly.
Well, I note that a letter was sent to the Permanent Secretary. I don't know whether I couldn't find a reply. It may well be they've not had a reply, that the committee has not had a reply. Well, I would suggest that civil servants in the Home Office need to respond with expedition to the committee, to come back to them with furnishing them with information. But it does seem to me that that is the way that we could have proceeded, and that the front bench have missed a trick here by actually couching their resolution in more specific terms, with the consent perhaps that I'm sure would have been forthcoming from the respective chairs of the select committees. But that's not the motion we have before us, Mr Deputy Speaker. I do hope, I'll give way very briefly.
As Deputy Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, I'd like to inform my right honourable friend and the House that the Public Accounts Committee has some of the most sensitive information available in a private reading room capacity, so there is no reason at all why we shouldn't hold this information.
I'm hugely grateful to my honourable friend. He is a parliamentarian of great experience, and he is absolutely right to make that point. And I would urge that consideration of that course upon my honourable friend in the dispatch box to consider whether that could be a way forward. Now, when you have a policy, you put and perhaps outline it in the form of an opposition day motion, Mr Deputy Speaker. When you don't have much of a policy, you rely upon process arguments and humble address requests. And that is what we see today, I'm afraid. My honourable friend, the member for Shoreham, East Worthing and Shoreham, put it extremely powerfully in his remarks a moment ago, that the Labour front bench is a party still in search of a coherent and cogent approach to this most serious of issues. It's all very well coming up with ideas that are already being used and deployed by the government. It's all very well saying, we'll do it the same but a bit better. That isn't up to the level of the events that face us. It's a challenge not just for the United Kingdom, but the entire Western world, as climate change and conflict mean that we see mass migration of peoples out of harm's way, or indeed for economic reasons. These are the challenges that face governments of all stripes and colours. And I'm glad to say that it is this government that, through its arrangements and its agreement with Albania, has achieved singular success in the last year in reducing those unacceptable numbers on small boats coming across the channel. It is this government that is painstakingly working its way through bilateral agreements with key countries to speed up the process of returns, to make sure that we can clear our prisons of foreign national offenders rather than having to hold them in immigration facilities after the expiration of their sentence, but is seeking, I think, in an honest and realistic way, to try and answer the question of what on earth do you do with individuals who have had their applications determined, who have failed in their applications, but who the country of origin refuses to even recognise exist. That is, I'm afraid, the big question, the $64,000 question. Perhaps I should adjust that for inflation, Mr Deputy Speaker, that needs to be addressed and faced up to. And I know my honourable friend is grappling with that problem as his predecessors have done. There is nothing wrong in law or in principle with seeking to work with third countries to process asylum claims.
I'm going to reserve my remarks for next week's two-day debate on the floor of the House. I will ask this question, that it is interesting that the Rwanda scheme is different from other schemes such as the Australian scheme, in that we are not using UK law to determine these applications. We are in fact outsourcing the whole thing to Rwanda, and that sometimes isn't fully understood. And I have to say that I think has been a bit of a glass jaw that was quite broken by the Supreme Court in its judgment in November. But having said that, we are in a position now where I think that we have a government that is seeking maturely to try and deal with the position, and an opposition that is saying that even if Rwanda works, they won't do it. Now, I don't think that sort of extreme approach is what the British people want to see. It's not, I think, what this policy debate needs. What we need is an acceptance that actually what was being looked at by the previous Labour government in terms of third country solutions is the right approach, and that only by taking that particular line will we manage to crack this most difficult of problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The unworkability and costs of the Rwanda scheme are representative of this government's dysfunctional approach to asylum application as a whole. Faced with an election this year and having failed to stop the boats, indeed, the failure was such that 2023 was the second highest year ever in terms of the number of boat crossings. The grand plan is now to embark on a £400 million gamble on the promise to stop the boats. That's £400 million of taxpayers' money being lumped on one number at the roulette table, with nothing other than blind faith being relied upon that this scheme will actually deal with the problem. What started as distraction tactics as part of Operation Save Big Dog has become a central government policy as part of Operation Save Ourselves. And I'm probably overstating it by saying blind faith has been shown in the plan. The Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, the previous Home Secretary and the previous Immigration Minister all seem to have privately had doubts about it when in office. And I don't think anything I've heard from the government benches today has persuaded me that this is anything other than being driven by desperation. Indeed, when the Prime Minister was challenged on Koonsberg on Sunday about his time as Chancellor, when he supposedly examined the scheme, he said of the deterrent effect that it would supposedly have. In effect, he said, "We haven't tried this before, so we might as well give it a go." His precise words were, "This hasn't been tried before in our country. It's fair to say it's novel. I've been very clear that this is a novel scheme." Well, I'm all for innovation, but £400 million being spent on something on the basis that we haven't tried it before ought to be ringing alarm bells, particularly when nothing else that this government has tried has stopped the boats either. It seems that the government's approach now is, in effect, its third time lucky. So that's £400 million at least. No, I haven't got time, sorry. So it's £400 million at least, and there may be other costs we don't know about, which is why our motion is so important. And I thought taking back control meant an end to handing over millions of pounds to foreign powers without anything coming back in return. The government's own impact assessment says it is uncertain what level of deterrence it will have, and given deterrence is the whole point of the bill, there really couldn't be a clearer case of the headline first approach that this government takes from so many things, which is why from housing to health to education to the economy, we are in such a mess. The most optimistic scenario is that about 1% of those across the Channel can expect to be sent to Rwanda. That's if all the numerous hurdles we've talked about are overcome. Is there really anyone who's going to say, oh, that 1% risk is not something I'm going to take a chance on? Of course not. It's just a giant smokescreen to cover up the government's many failings. And those who work day to day in housing asylum seekers don't appear to have much confidence in the likelihood of there being any deterrent effect either. You can go online and see that Serco, responsible for housing asylum seekers in private housing, are still advertising to landlords that they can guarantee rents for up to 5 years for doing so. They would hardly be doing that if they thought Rwanda was going to be a success, or if they thought any other government policies in this area were likely to have any effect. So in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, there is nothing I've seen from the Rwanda agreement that will deliver on the claims that are being made about it. Never before has so much been given by so many for so little in return. And when we have record taxation levels, public services on their knees and record government debt, it is right that we challenge and question whether all this expenditure does what it says on the tin. It does actually seem that the Prime Minister agrees with our approach. And I'll end with some words from his appearance on Koonsberg on Sunday again. When he was asked about the examination of the scheme, he said, You should always ask probing questions. You should always approach things from a position of scepticism to ensure that you get value for money for taxpayers. And that exactly is what the Labour motion seeks to do. And the fact that the government are set to oppose it says to me everything that we need to know about why there is so little confidence that this scheme will deliver. Putting Rwanda rhetoric ahead of reality is a really poor way to run the country, and it is no wonder with such an approach that that government is running scared of the people's verdict.
Sir Robert Sims.
Thank you very much. When I first came into the House, I was on the immigration bill under Labour government, and the key difficulty was people coming on aircraft and ferries and in lorries, road haulers. Yes. And that was dealt with eventually, particularly in places like Dover, by putting in machinery to look at the heat for bodies, and that stopped that trade. But this is a very profitable trade. Yep. And there are very inventive people, criminals. They look for how they can get around. Yep. And they decided that rubber boats were one way of getting people in. And our maritime tradition and the treaties we've signed up to over hundreds of years mean it's very difficult to deal with people once they set off to sea. And the government have a plan, and they have a strategy to deal with this. And I think the opposition would have, more authority in this debate if A, they hadn't opposed the plan and the strategy, and if instead of having a policy themselves, they didn't shuffle the papers around and ask all the questions and bemoan all the cost, but not actually set out what they were going to do. And of course, the humble address, Home Office have a different view, and you expect ministers to argue privately and then come to a fixed position. But if you keep asking for papers to try and find out what the differences are, what you do is you drive these debates underground and onto WhatsApps or into private meetings, which I don't think means good government. And the fact that the current Prime Minister was arguing a slightly different point when he was in charge of the money proves he was doing a good job as Chancellor. Yeah. He was sort of kicking the tires and ensuring that actually things had been thought through. So I think we can see today the motion as a substitute for having a policy. Yeah. It's just to say that we're rubbish and they will do things better, but they don't actually specify what they're going to do better. My view is that we do have a policy, and I think the $64,000 question was the member for East Worthing and Shoreham said, is that people who come into the UK who can't be returned to their own countries, and that is the ideal thing, it's to have country-to-country agreements, which proving they're working. I'm glad we've got more of them, and is a number of the part of the strand for dealing with the issue is that if you have an Iran or an Eritrea or a country where somebody might have a life-threatening problem if they're returned, we need somewhere else for them to go. And Rwanda have made it part of their agenda because it's financially to their benefit to do deals with countries like Britain to help deal with a problem. And I think everybody can be a winner if we actually get there in the end. And there's no point in people here in the debate saying that this isn't going to be a deterrent when it hasn't actually been tried. Yeah. When every time we've tried to implement it, there have been a range of people, not least some of the courts. The government are legislating to deal with the concerns of our Supreme Court. We have a treaty which is based on international law. We will see whether or not it works, and I hope when it's proved to work, that some of those who are criticising will stand up in this chamber and say, actually, you were right.
Riley. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The government's approach to asylum seekers can at best be described as a farce. The asylum applications backlog persists and is growing. Thousands of people have simply disappeared into the underground economy, with the Home Office admitting that they have lost track of nearly 17,000 people. The continued use of hotel accommodation is costing the British taxpayer untold millions, whilst the disgraced Rwanda plan limps ahead, a plan which even the Prime Minister admitted is costly and unworkable. It is no surprise, therefore, that the government continues to refuse to disclose the full cost of the scheme. When the Prime Minister came into office, he promised professionalism, integrity and accountability at every level. One thing for sure, that he has failed at every level on all three of these subjects. From what we know from what we do know, is that the government has already paid £240 million to Rwanda. Further money in the hundreds of millions of the scheme will be paid, and it will cost £100 million more to operate, with additional per person costs of nearly £170,000 per person relocated to Rwanda. Given that it costs £12,000 to process asylum claims in the UK, the cost benefit of the Rwanda scheme seems non-existent. And this is before one even begins to consider the moral and ethical costs of deporting people to Rwanda. The UK Supreme Court found that in sending asylum seekers would be unlawful, given substantial grounds to believe that those transferred there could be sent back to the countries where people could face persecution and inhumane treatment. We would do well to remember that according to the 1951 Refugee Convention, any person seeking asylum has the right to apply for asylum in the UK and remain here until the authorities have assessed their claim. Furthermore, it is also recognised that persons fleeing persecution may use irregular means to escape and claim asylum. The Rwanda scheme, along with the government's continued criminalisation of asylum seekers crossing the Channel, amount to complete repudiation of international law and a universal obligations to which we, the UK, are bound to assist those seeking safety and security. I have, Mr. Deputy Speaker, no doubt that the British public will see the government's effort regarding the Rwanda plan for what it is: a flagrant, cynical and cruel attempt to force through costly and unworkable legislation, contrary to the findings of the Supreme Court, in a desperate bid to salvage an already ruined reputation. The asylum seeking system in the UK is in crisis, and it is precisely due to the continued incompetence of this government and its ministers that the crisis has come about, and will persist until a Labour government is elected to sort this mess out.
Speaker, listening to this debate, I think there may be a complete misunderstanding of the fundamental point about this legislation. It is a deterrent. I could pluck any figure out of the air, and if the deterrent effect of this, together with other measures, is to reduce to hopefully zero the number of channel crossings, then that will be money well spent. It is a deterrent. I agreed with absolutely every word my honourable friend and fellow committee member of the Home Affairs Select Committee from Worthing and Shoreham said in respect of this. I don't know how many members in this chamber have actually been to those beaches in Calais and actually engaged with people and asked people their views on whether this is a deterrent or not. Well, I, my honourable friend, and one of the best politicians I know, the chair of the Select Committee, and I hope she didn't mind me being nice to her in this chamber at all. But when you talk about the position, we talked about select committees. We've actually been there. French officials who are working on the front line support this policy. And what is the evidence they can point to say that there was a deterrent effect? Well, as my honourable friend has said, when the policy was announced, there was a rush to get over before the policy was actually put in place. When we were speaking to people who were coming across, and it may come as a shock to members opposite, the people who we were speaking to on the beaches were nearly universally single males in their 20s. All of them were saying to us, well, the vast majority that I spoke to, perhaps I stand to be corrected if I'm wrong in respect to this, is they were coming for purely economic perspectives. They saw the streets of the United Kingdom as streets paved with gold. That was the reason why they were here. So what we do have is the only piece of evidence that can be put forward by the members of the Select Committee who've actually been there shows that this is going to have a deterrent effect, this is going to work, and there's not a shred of evidence put forward from the other side that this policy is not going to work. Now, I understand, because my I'm going to say honourable friend, is an extremely good politician. I sit on this committee, and the questions that are asked in respect of costings are extremely fair. And my honourable friend, the Minister, will answer those, I'm sure, in the way and has answered many of them before the Select Committee. But when we talk about the principle behind this bill, I do wonder sometimes in terms of, I asked the Shadow Home Secretary whether the Labour Party were considering the use of offshore processing. There was no answer, and the reason why we know there is no answer is because they are considering it. Keir Starmer said he will consider any plan that works. Rwanda will work, so he's going to have to accept Rwanda on that logic. And I wonder what the members opposite make of the Austrian and German governments who are considering this type processing asylum seekers abroad. You know, that bastion of right-wing extremism, Denmark, passed a law in 2001 allowing refugees to be moved to asylum centres in third countries for processing. The EU, which is exactly the organisation that the party opposite based themselves on, indirectly supports offshore asylum processing as part of broader efforts to stop refugees coming across the Mediterranean. And the bloc, I can't believe I'm saying this, the bloc is paying billions, not millions, billions of dollars to keep refugees from reaching Greece, and has funded the Libyan Coast Guard to push migrant boats back from Europe, back to North Africa from Europe. Perhaps we could ask the French to do that, and I'll leave that question hanging in the air for my honourable friend. And there is even that, to top everything else off, there's even a UN programme called the Emergency Transit Programme, where more than 3,000 people are moved from Libyan detention centres who are heading for Europe into Niger. A similar scheme for asylum seekers from Libya was put in place to Rwanda. Every international body supports what we're doing. They're all spending money. They all believe it's a deterrent effect. The opposition have no policy. What is the debate? This debate is a complete gimmick. The government policy is the only policy in town. It is being followed by other countries. It will work.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I'm not sure if the member for Bury North has read the motion before the House, but it is about the cost of the scheme, and it restricts itself entirely to that. But as a result, the motion today essentially comes down to one thing: transparency. Do we believe that our constituents deserve to know how much of their money this government plans to spend on their shambolic Rwanda scheme? And do we believe that they also deserve to see the full details of the asylum backlog clearance programme, so they can understand how it is possible for the Home Office to have lost track of thousands of asylum seekers? Ministers need to be... time does not allow for that, I apologise. Ministers need to be held to account for an expensive shambles that has sent more Home Secretaries to Rwanda than asylum seekers, all while our borders remain in a state of chaos and desperate people suffer enormously at the hands of people smugglers. Yet here we have the government ducking transparency on the cost of this scheme yet again. But what we do know is that £240 million has been sent to Rwanda already, with £50 million more scheduled for this spring. And we know too that the Home Office has admitted that there are at least 2 further payments planned for the next 2 years, but they won't confirm how much these payments will be. Why not? We also know that ministers have promised extra payments for every individual asylum seeker sent, but again they have refused to say how much this will cost, and again, why on earth not? Presumably they've told their Rwandan counterparts how much they are paying them. So if the minister is still refusing to disclose these costs in this place, perhaps he can answer why he thinks the Rwandan government should know more about how British taxpayers' money is spent than British taxpayers themselves. Mr Deputy Speaker, I won't, and the honourable gentleman is aware of the time constraints before us, so I apologise, but I won't do so. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister and this government are taking the British public for fools, not just over the Rwanda scheme, but over asylum backlogs too. It is categorically false to claim these backlogs have been cleared. The current overall backlog is almost 100,000 asylum cases, and even the so-called legacy backlog remains at around 4,500 cases. But amidst this chaos, Home Office officials have admitted that as many as 17,000 asylum seekers are now missing from their system and they have no clue where they are. But perhaps the worst thing is that this complete dysfunction no longer shocks anybody. Who could be surprised that asylum policy is in chaos with a Conservative Party that has given us 8 Home Secretaries in 8 years, 3 failed pieces of legislation on channel crossings in 3 years, and spent vast sums of money on a Rwanda scheme that has been declared unlawful by the highest court in the land? Mr Deputy Speaker, convictions for people smugglers are 30% lower under this government compared to the last Labour government, and returns of failed asylum seekers are 50% lower now than they were under Labour. Ultimately, if they had confidence in their record on asylum or their strength of this Rwanda scheme, then they would have nothing to hide. And if they had nothing to hide, Mr Deputy Speaker, they would release the figures requested by supporting this motion today.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it's an interesting and important debate we're having this afternoon. You know, we're set in a context of increasingly large numbers of people on the move in a global context. Climate change is driving them forward. You know, entrepreneurial amongst them are looking for economic opportunity, as my honourable friend has mentioned. But on what Rwanda seeks to stop, I think it is worth dwelling. What is actually happening to some of the most vulnerable people in the world? They have got criminal gangsters coming up to them in countries in Asia, the Far East, Africa, getting hold of them, you know, maybe even coercing them slightly, and saying, you know what, you sell Granny's farm because the streets of the UK are absolutely paved with gold. You give us 5, 8, 10 grand, sell Granny's farm to mortgage it, you'll be able to make a fortune and look after her. And it's only when they're on a beach in Calais with a gangster pointing a gun at them, saying, get in an overcrowded and dangerous boat, do they realise what we are trying to stop? They are being sold a pup by criminals. And what this debate is about today is not about point scoring and policy, although you wouldn't believe it if you listen to some of the stuff from the benches opposite. You know, we're taking action to tackle it. You know, we're making sure it's if you come to this country illegally, you can't stay here illegally, because we're then opening the window to a demand model from gangsters that were strapping kids under lorries under Tony Blair and are now strapping young men, teenagers, women and children to dangerous boats across the crossing. So we're working with France, we're working with Albania. The Home Office is taking lots of steps to make sure that further downstream, like where you buy the boats from, is being tackled. We've got internet, we've got a treaty with a country, we're sorting out accommodation, we're sorting out the backlogs, we're getting involved, we're putting more staff in. So what do the benches opposite offer us? They offer us a highly moralising case. I think if it's not clear from my remarks, I am absolutely clear that there is an incredibly moral case to take every action we can possibly take to stop these people getting done by criminals. So what does the Labour Party do? They vote against it. Is it 76 times, 73 times, 83 times? Goodness knows, right. Well, I defer to the knowledge of my honourable gentleman. You know, you've got young people, or you've got people here putting actual practical ideas in place. What's the Labour Party doing is just changing their mind. They've got no plan, they've got no ideas, they've got a series of soundbites so brittle they can't take interventions from this side of the chamber. What we've got is a worked through plan that's trying something different to make sure that we handle a global context. And if I seek to kind of close off here, everybody is facing this problem. And when you look at the crossings down by a third already, there is some nascent deterrent effect occurring. When we talk about the work that's going on with the social media firms to make sure that these ... rude word gangsters cannot sell absolute nonsense on TikTok, on Facebook, to kids that just dream of a better life, you know, that's the action that we're taking. So what's Labour going to do? They're going to bring forward process motions, they're going to ask for the details, and crucially, they're not going to tell us what their plan is because they haven't got one.
And I want to start by thanking the Shadow Secretary of State for her calling this debate today. It's an emotive issue and it affects every single one of us. And that's why we need to be open, honest and upfront with the people of the UK about how we protect our borders and tackle migration. Now, I'd like to thank the Welsh Refugee Council for the tireless work that they do with refugees and asylum seekers, in spite of the horrific abuse they've faced from the far right. And they're a standout example of Wales putting into practice its ethos of a nation of sanctuary, and they deserve our praise. And I'd also like to thank the sanctuary run by the Gap in Newport, and a particular thanks to Mark and Sarah for their diligence, passion and advocacy. And their innovative ideas and compassion working with refugees and asylum seekers is a credit to them. Now, I'd like to touch on the financial mess we're in now, because the government need to come clean about the likely cost of the British taxpayer, which is at least £400 million. And that's without a single asylum seeker being sent to Rwanda. All this is happening when the cost of living crisis continues to hit the poorest in our country hardest, in Newport West and across the United Kingdom. But yet, Tory ministers seemingly have no concern, no issue and no shame with wasting taxpayers' money on a scheme that simply won't work. So is it any surprise that our unelected Conservative Prime Minister thought the scheme wasn't worth the money? I tell you what, Mr Deputy Speaker, for the first time I agree with him. On the asylum backlog, the unelected Prime Minister is taking us for fools. His claim to have cleared the asylum backlog is completely false. The current overall backlog, as we've already heard, is almost 100,000 asylum cases, which is why record numbers of people are still in asylum hotels, costing the taxpayer £8 million a day, 12 months after the Prime Minister promised to end it. The Tories haven't even cleared the so-called legacy backlog, with 4,500 cases still unresolved and tens of thousands of people having been simply withdrawn by the Home Office. And I have some experience of the backlog in my constituency. I can tell this House it's a very real problem. I have real people in Newport West waiting for Home Office decisions, like the Ethiopian student who's been waiting for a decision on his interview, which he had in 2021, and he's still not heard. And another husband, wife and 4 children who applied for citizenship in December 2021, and they are still waiting too. These are just the tip of the iceberg, but let's remember these are real people doing their best in very difficult circumstances. And on the opposite side of the coin, we have officials admitting that as many as 17,000 people are missing. They don't know where they are, and they may well be in the underground economy. What a disgraceful state of affairs. So can the Minister tell us how many asylum backlog cases were cleared simply by removing people from the list? And does the Minister know where those individuals are? The motion before the House today is calling for the Home Office to publish the full cost of the Rwanda scheme, as they did for the France Cooperation Programme, where funding has been announced up until 2026. Now, over the last 6 years, the Tories have let the criminal smuggler gangs take over the channel and allowed Home Office asylum decision-making to collapse. We got record high asylum backlogs with huge delays, and the taxpayers having to fund asylum hotels. This is the Tories' asylum chaos, and they are failing to fix it. Labour's plan will strengthen our border security, smash the criminal gang networks and their supply chains with new powers and a new cross-border police unit. We will clear the backlog with new fast-track systems, end hotel use, saving the taxpayer over £2 billion, and improve enforcement with a new returns and enforcement unit to reverse the collapse in returns for those who have no rights to be here. This is how we in the United Kingdom can do our bit to help genuine asylum seekers fleeing persecution and conflict, but return those with no rights to be here. But under the Tories, we have none of this, just more chaos. So the sooner we get rid of them, the better.
Sarah Edwards. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I would like to start by emphasising that many asylum seekers are fleeing abhorrent conditions and that many of us in the chamber could only imagine. And it's important that we do not lose sight of those stories. But we must end the current chaotic approach adopted by the government. Whilst the unworkable, unaffordable Rwanda plan claims to deal with 100 people, we need a proper plan to deal with the 100,000 people's cases stuck in the backlog of the system. Mr Deputy Speaker, in my constituency of Tamworth, local residents are concerned about the use of the Holiday Inn to host asylum seekers. This enormous backlog of cases means that many are still there. They are concerned that not only about the fact that the hotel costs the taxpayer £8 million a day, but that the hotel plays a fundamental role in the local community and economy. Some of those have now been living in the hotel for years, so long that they have the right to work and are contributing to a charity in the local community. Some who've even been baptised in the local church, but have been moved to other locations and once again find themselves uprooted in this chaos. For those that have clearly tried to settle in the community, but whose applications have still not been processed, this is a terrible failing. Tamworth is a beautiful town and many people come to visit. We are proud of our local heritage and landmark tourism sites, whether it be Drayton Manor Theme Park, the Snow Dome or Tamworth Castle. The Holiday Inn should be for holidays. £8 million a day would go a huge way in Tamworth redeveloping its town centre and bolstering its tourism economy. This money could be far better spent in revitalising local communities across the country. My constituents want to know that those seeking refuge and who are eligible have their claims dealt with swiftly and fairly, but they also want their hotel back. Can the government explain why it's taking so long to recruit the staff needed to process the applications, which they cut years ago and that have landed them in this mess in the first place? I call on my colleagues to adopt Labour's plan to strengthen our border security, clear the backlog once and for all, and finally bring an end to this hotel use. This includes recruiting the Home Office caseworkers to clear the backlog and 1,000 staff for the returns unit so that those who do not have the right to stay can be quickly removed. Crucially, the plan will crack down on the criminal smuggler gangs through the cross-border police unit and deeper security cooperation with Europe. The Rwanda plan has seen £240 million of taxpayer money paid to Rwanda so far, yet not one asylum seeker has been sent to the country. The current overall backlog is almost 100,000 cases, resulting in record numbers of people still being in the asylum hotels like that of Tamworth, 12 months after the Prime Minister promised to end them. I know in Tamworth my constituents are concerned about the use of the Holiday Inn to host asylum seekers, which they feel is a waste of money. So when can we have our hotel back? We still do not have a clear idea of just how much the taxpayer money is going to be funneled into this broken project. We have weakened border security, a broken asylum system, criminal gangs taking advantage and risking lives, and record levels of boat crossings. Transparency is fundamental to any good democracy, with this level of taxpayer money being funneled into a scheme where we are yet to see 100 asylum seekers sent to Rwanda. The Home Office must publish the full costs of the Rwanda scheme, as well as the full details of the asylum backlog clearance programme, so that we know how many people the Home Office has lost track of and what decisions are being taken. I call on my colleagues to adopt Labour's plan to strengthen our border security, clear the backlog once and for all, and finally bring an end to the use of Tamworth's Holiday Inn as an asylum hotel. Labour's plan includes recruiting the additional caseworkers that could deal with this.
Michael Shanes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The last debate we had in this place on this Rwanda plan was such a bizarre moment, watching members on the benches opposite lobby one another from the one side of the party to the other with threats to vote against the bill, all quietly dispensed with when the moment finally came. Today we seemed to have a bit of consensus on the opposite benches, consensus to withhold the transparency from the taxpayers on how much their plan is going to cost. I'm surprised that this is a part of this debate that we don't agree on, because surely we can all agree that taxpayers' money, the public have an interest in knowing how that's being spent. I haven't yet heard any explanations from the opposite side on why withholding this information is so difficult. Perhaps it's because the economic note attached to the bill has the intriguing section under cost and benefit summary, where it states there are no monetised costs or benefits. And further, the assessment isn't even convinced that the plan will work. It says, dependent on the deterrent effect achieved, there could be fewer individuals undertaking the hazardous and unnecessary journey. As I said in the last time we debated this, I think we are all united in wanting to bring an end to these dangerous crossings, but it's clear the government doesn't even have confidence themselves that this plan will work, which is why nobody was particularly surprised by the recent news reports that the Prime Minister himself wasn't convinced by it either. And instead of facing up to the government's failures on immigration, we're presented with this distraction, and a hugely costly one at that. And of course, the chairs of the Home Affairs Select Committee and the Public Accounts Committee have had to drag out of witnesses the fact that even more money is being spent on this in years to come. In December, the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office told the Public Accounts Committee that he couldn't confirm any future funding had been agreed for Rwanda, and I think I heard the Minister in his opening remarks say that the government of Rwanda asked for no money and no money was offered, which means either future years was already agreed in advance or we're not sending any further money to Rwanda. In either case, the easiest thing would be for the government to simply confirm one way or another what funding is being sent. And of course, these are only the costs that we know about. Aside from the financial cost, there is also a broader cost to this absurd plan, a moral cost. The Home Office's own statistics show that at least 6 out of 10 of those who made the dangerous Channel crossing to the UK last year would be recognised as refugees and would therefore be given asylum in this country. So it's not even a plan that's going to tackle that particular problem. And it doesn't deal with the criminal gangs themselves who are exploiting these vulnerable people in the first place. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, there's also a cost to Britain's standing in the world, a diminishing of our sense that we follow the rule of law, that we simply pass laws now saying that one thing is true even if it's not. There will be a flurry of amendments, I've no doubt, being drafted as we speak for next week's debates. The agreement we've seen on the opposite benches today, I'm sure, will disappear by Tuesday as we see this bill back before us, and it may not even pass. But as unpalatable as I find this legislation, to those on the government benches who do support it, I can't understand why there is no transparency in the cost of it. If this is a policy that you believe in, if it's a rock-solid proposal, if it presents good value for money, if the costs are already written down somewhere, as we know that they are, why not just tell us what they are? The very least this government should do today, with no effort whatsoever, is to release the financial cost to the public so that we know how much of our taxpayer money is being spent.
From bench, Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to pay tribute to all those colleagues who've taken the time to speak today, and particularly like to pay tribute to the Chair of the Select Committee and to my honourable friends, the members for Ellesmere Port, Birmingham Hall Green, Stretford and Urmston, Newport West, Tamworth and Rutherglen Glen and Hamilton West, who made really excellent contributions to this debate. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's crystal clear that the money being wasted on this fantasy, this fixation that the benches opposite choose to indulge in, would be far better spent on proper investment in a cross-border police unit and a security partnership with Europol to go after the criminal gangs upstream, smash those gangs and stop the boats getting in the water in the first place. That is what the Labour Party has spent the last year urging the Prime Minister to do. That is what we would do in government to help end this Tory small boats chaos. And yet the Prime Minister has instead chosen to bury his head in the sand and to double down on failure. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Rwanda farce is so riddled with absurdity that it's difficult to know where to start. But perhaps the most absurd aspect of all of this is that the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary actually agree with the Labour position on this whole sorry mess. They are Rwanda sceptics, Mr Deputy Speaker. They are non-believers. Last week it emerged that when he was Chancellor and during his leadership bid, the Prime Minister privately indicated that he had profound concerns over the value for money and the workability of this harebrained Rwanda scheme. The deterrent won't work, he wrote. How extraordinary, then, that he's now staking his entire premiership on a scheme that he doesn't even believe in. How humiliating it must be for him to know that his backbenchers are pushing him around. They're calling the shots. Because when all is said and done, what has the Tories' farcical Rwanda fixation delivered? They've sent 3 Home Secretaries to Rwanda, but not a single asylum seeker. There's been plenty of pie in the sky, Mr Deputy Speaker, but not a single plane in the sky. Now, I mentioned earlier the strong contributions from the benches behind me. I was, however, struggling a bit to understand the logic of the Minister's point about the information being requested around the cost of the Rwanda plan being somehow commercially sensitive. Because the government were all too happy to reveal that they're forking out £500 million on paying the French police to puncture dinghies on the beaches of Calais. And the Permanent Secretary told the Public Affairs Committee that the Public Affairs Committee that the Rwanda-related costs will be revealed in the accounts in July. Why not just reveal them now? What are they afraid of? Well, they're clearly terrified of admitting that they're blowing £400 million of taxpayers' money on this failing scheme. They should fess up and reveal what the real costs are, both in terms of what it will cost to fly each individual asylum seeker halfway around the world and what it will cost in terms of processing and related support. We know it's at least £169,000 per asylum seeker, but if they can confirm, is it even higher, £200,000 or more, as was said earlier? What have they got to hide? Well, perhaps we know what they've got to hide, that this Rwanda plan is unaffordable and unworkable. Even if flights take off, they will be about 1% of the 30,000 channel crossers at a maximum. That's not even going to scratch the surface of the people smugglers' business model. And meanwhile, more than 100,000 asylum cases are unresolved, despite the deceitful nonsense the Prime Minister puts out on social media. Nearly 400 hotels being used for asylum seekers, a number that's gone up, not down under this Prime Minister. 56,000 asylum seekers languishing in those hotels, costing the taxpayer a staggering £8 million a day. We need transparency on this. We need transparency around the issue of withdrawn claims. Astonishingly, 1/3 of the recently processed asylum claims that the Prime Minister has been boasting about clearing, and yet they haven't even been processed properly. As an exercise in the politics of smoke and mirrors, this is surely without parallel. Did the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary seriously think that nobody would notice? Did they seriously think they could pull the wool over the eyes of the British public? What an insult to the intelligence of the electorate. They should come clean to the British public with a full breakdown of the 35,000 withdrawn claims. Who are they? Where are they? Are they simply reapplying, or are they drifting away into the underground economy, never to be heard of again? Last summer, the Conservative member for South Thanet described this trend as an amnesty by the back door. Is he right? The Minister must come clean on these points. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we need a serious plan. We need the end of these headline-grabbing antics. We need common sense, hard graft, and international cooperation, as has been set out in Labour's 5-point plan for the last year. The benches don't like it, opposite, but the fact of the matter is that their plan isn't working. They need to come clean over these costs. They need to clear this backlog, and I'm urging members on all sides of the House to support our humble address today so that we can begin the long road back to recovery. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Oh, Mr. Deputy Speaker, Mr. Deputy, how much I enjoyed the smile on the Shadow Minister's face as he wound up there. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am delighted to have the opportunity to close and wind up this debate. My only disappointment, perhaps even a slight sadness, is that this motion is more about process than it is about substance. Because on the substance, what we haven't heard from the benches opposite is the costs of not acting. There's the financial cost. The illegal migration costs to the British taxpayer billions of pounds a year, including £8 million a day, as my honourable friend mentioned, for emergency housing, pressures on public services and more. But there's also the human cost, the moral case for our Rwanda policy, and I'm going to turn to my honourable friend's speech in a few moments, the compassionate case for our Rwanda policy. How many more lives, Mr. Deputy Speaker, must be lost in the Channel before the parties opposite join us in our mission to put an end to these dangerous journeys? Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Rwanda policy is one part of an intensive and focused strategy for tackling illegal migration. As my honourable friend has pointed out, this plan is delivering. Small boat crossings are down by 36%, a reduction that has been achieved even as numbers rise elsewhere in Europe. But we know that there is more to do, and the Rwanda policy will give us a powerful tool to complete this mission. Mr. Deputy Speaker, let me turn to some of the contributions from the backbenchers. May I turn and start off with the SNP, actually the SNP frontbench spokesman. May I say that I didn't disagree with everything that she said. She threatens to resign even as I say that, and I knew she would be disappointed because I agreed with her on this point. She rightly challenged Labour as to what their plan was. She is right to ask those questions, questions that have been repeated across this House. My honourable friend, the member for East Worthing and Shoreham, was right to set out that this is a complex and challenging issue. He is absolutely right. There's no lack of robust scrutiny from him, not least during the course of the Home Affairs Select Committee, but he rightly pointed out a lack of credibility from Labour, that there was no plan, that there was no alternative put forward. I look forward to further scrutiny from him, and he rightly said that this motion is a Labour gimmick and a con. The Right Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull North, she did address the substance of the motion, and she was credited for that by my Right Honourable and learned friend. But what she didn't set out was what Labour's plan was in the alternative. My Right Honourable and learned friend reminded us that this was a process debate, not a debate of substance, but one of process. And he rightly said, when you don't have much of a policy, you rely on process debates and humble addresses. How right he was. This is a global issue, and Labour's one policy is that even if Rwanda works, they would scrap it. My honourable friend and neighbour, the member for Poole, set out his experience, and I treat it very seriously, not only because he's my neighbour, but he is an MP with a port in his constituency. He put it well. This motion is a substitute for having a policy, and how right he was. My honourable friend, the member for Bury North, I don't have time to delve into each and every one of his interventions. He rightly commented that this debate is a gimmick, but he also set out quite seriously the deterrent effect that is part of our Rwanda scheme. And my honourable friend, the member for South Ribble, set out some of the most vulnerable people we are talking about, and they are being coerced by criminal gangs. And she was right to state that and to state the moral case for our policy. Mr Deputy Speaker, the government does have a plan, this Rwanda plan, for deterring those dangerous journeys. But what again is the opposition's plan? They do not have one. Their only reported plan is one that would increase the number of asylum seekers to this country by allowing them to make claims from other countries. We do not accept that proposition. It would mean taking people from safe countries where they can already seek refuge from persecution, and there is no way that we could accommodate each and every one of those claims. What is their plan? Labour have voted against our plans, as we have heard during the course of this debate. 86 times, Mr Deputy Speaker. 86 times they have voted against our measures, but we will not be deterred. We will do right by the decent, law-abiding people of this country who want and expect secure borders and an effective immigration system. When people with no right to be here know that they will not be able to stay, they will stop coming. And we know the deterrent effect because we have seen it with Albania. A year ago, the Prime Minister secured the deal with Albania. Planes took off and over 5,000 people have been returned to Albania. The deterrent effect has worked. Arrivals are down by over 90%. It has worked with Albania. It will work with Rwanda. Illegal migration costs lives. It costs billions of pounds a year. We need to end it. We will end it, and we will stop the boats.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no? No! Division. Clear the lobbies. Paper. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Contrary, no? No! Tell us for the ayes, Samantha Dixon and Tonya Antoniazzi. Tell us for the noes, Michael Wood and Suzanne Webb.